there is a question nobody really asks about football. Not about formations, not about statistics, not about trophies. The question is simpler than all of that, and somehow more important. What does football feel like when you cannot see it? Not the tactics, not the result, not the name on the scoreboard at the end. What does the actual thing feel like? The living, breathing, unpredictable, electric thing that happens between a man and a ball, between a player and a crowd, between one moment and the next. When your eyes cannot give you any of it. Most people never think about this question. They have never needed to. They take the seeing for granted, the way you take breathing for granted until suddenly the air is gone. But on a cold November evening in Barcelona, in the year 2004, one man thought about exactly that question. And the answer he gave changed the life of a boy who had never once seen the game he loved more than anything in the world. This is that story. His name was Marco. He was 9 years old, and he had been blind since birth. Not partially blind, not visually impaired in the gentle, softened way that phrase sometimes implies. Completely, totally, permanently blind. He had never seen a color, had never seen a face, had never seen a sky or a street or a tree in autumn, had never seen his own hands. What he had was sound and touch, and the ability to build entire worlds inside his mind from the information those two senses gave him. He had built one world in particular with extraordinary detail and devotion. The world of football. Specifically, the world of one footballer. His father, a man named Eduardo, had been taking Marco to Camp Nou since Marco was 4 years old. Not because Eduardo believed his son would somehow see the game if they were close enough to it. He took him because he understood something that many sighted people never grasp, that being inside a place where something enormous is happening is its own kind of experience. Even without vision, the crowd, the noise, the vibration of 70,000 people rising to their feet at the same moment, the smell of the grass and the cold air and the food vendors, and the collective electricity of human beings united around a single shared event. These things are real. These things reach you whether your eyes work or not, and Marco absorbed them with an intensity that his father found both heartbreaking and magnificent. By the time Marco was 6, he could name every player in the Barcelona starting lineup by the sound of their name being chanted. He could identify the rhythm of different kinds of crowd response, the gasp that meant a chance had been missed, the roar that meant a goal, the sustained rising sound that meant something extraordinary was in progress, the collective held breath that meant nobody could quite believe what they were watching. He had his own radio in his bedroom. He listened to every match commentary. He memorized the commentators' voices and learned to read their tone, the way other children learned to read print. A slight catch in the voice meant surprise. A dropping note at the end of a sentence meant disappointment. A commentator suddenly abandoning all professional composure and simply screaming meant that something had happened, which language was struggling to contain. He listened to those moments most carefully. He played them back in his mind. He tried to construct, from every scrap of audio information available to him, some picture of what was happening on the grass far below the commentary booth. And slowly, over years of careful listening, he had developed an understanding of one player that was different in kind from his understanding of any other. Not just an appreciation, not just admiration, something closer to recognition. The feeling you get when you encounter something that seems to have been made specifically for you. Oh, as if the universe had arranged a particular frequency and you were the person tuned to receive it. That player was Ronaldinho. What Marco heard in the commentary when Ronaldinho was described was different from anything he heard about anyone else. The commentators changed when they talked about Ronaldinho. Their voices shifted. The professional distance they maintained, the careful, calibrated language of sports reporting, would suddenly slip and something else would come through. Wonder, mostly. Sometimes confusion, the kind that comes not from ignorance but from encountering something that does not fit any existing category. Sometimes laughter, not mocking laughter, the laughter of disbelief. The laughter that means, I have been watching football for 30 years, and I do not know what I just witnessed. Marco heard all of this. He catalogued it. He built his picture of Ronaldinho from it. What emerged was not a picture in any visual sense. It was something more like a presence. A quality. A sense of something that moved differently from everything around it, that operated according to different rules, that existed in football the way certain pieces of music exist in silence. By making everything around them more alive. His father Eduardo noticed how Marco's entire body changed when Ronaldinho's name came through the radio. The boy would go still in a particular way. Not the stillness of disinterest, but the stillness of total attention. Every cell pointed in one direction. In the spring of 2004, Eduardo made a decision. He was going to take Marco to a Barcelona match, not just to Camp Nou in general, which they had done before, always in modest seats, far from the action. He was going to find a way to get as close as possible. Close enough that the sounds would be different. Close enough that the vibration through the floor would be different. Close enough that the grass would be close enough to smell. It took him 4 months to arrange. He had very little money. He worked as a carpenter in a small workshop in the Example district of Barcelona, making custom furniture for people who had more money than he did. He saved carefully. He asked questions. He wrote a letter. A real letter. Handwritten, 3 pages long. To the Barcelona Football Club describing his son, describing what football meant to the boy, asking whether there was any way to arrange access to seats closer to the pitch for a child who was blind. He did not expect a response. He sent the letter and told himself that the attempt was the thing that mattered, that you could not always control outcomes, only effort. 3 weeks later, a response arrived. There were tickets, 2 seats, 3rd row, directly in line with the corner flag on the south side of the pitch. The club's communication noted that these were not premium seats in any conventional sense, but they were as close to the grass as it was possible to be while still sitting in the stands. Eduardo read the letter 3 times. Then he went to his son's room and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "We are going to see Barcelona play." Marco corrected him gently, in the way that children sometimes do when they have been doing something longer than the adults around them realize. "We are going to hear them play," he said, "and feel them play." His father said yes. "That is what I meant." The match was on a Tuesday evening in November. Barcelona were playing a Champions League fixture. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp and precise, as if the world has been brought into higher resolution by the temperature. Eduardo and Marco arrived 2 hours early. Eduardo had learned from previous visits that arriving early meant the stadium was still quiet enough for Marco to orient himself properly. To learn the particular acoustic signature of this specific place on this specific evening. To map the dimensions of the space from the way sound moved. Moved through it? To settle his body into the seat and understand exactly where he was in relation to everything around him. Marco sat in the 3rd row and listened to the stadium fill. He could track it with remarkable precision, the way the ambient noise changed as more people arrived. The way conversations multiplied and layered over each other until they became a kind of weather. Atmospheric, present everywhere at once. Impossible to locate in any single direction. He could hear the distant sound of studs on the tunnel floor, before the players emerged. He could hear the difference between the warm-up sounds and the sounds of the match itself beginning to become real. He held the seat armrests with both hands. His father watched him and said nothing, understanding that Marco needed quiet in these moments of arrival. Then something happened that neither of them had expected or planned. One of the Barcelona staff members, a young man who worked in the match-day operations, handling various organizational responsibilities in the area near the pitch, had noticed the boy in the third row during the pre-match period. He had noticed because of the way the boy was sitting. There was something in Marco's posture, in the quality of his stillness, in the way his face was oriented not toward the pitch, but slightly upward, as if he was reading the air rather than watching the grass, that made the staff member stop and look. He came down to the row and spoke quietly to Eduardo. He asked, gently and without any assumption in his voice, whether the boy was blind. Eduardo said yes. The staff member nodded and said he would be back in a few minutes. What happened in the next 15 minutes belongs to the part of any story that is almost impossible to write properly, because the thing that happened was so simple that describing it in detail risks making it sound smaller than it was. But here is what happened. The staff member went through a door near the tunnel entrance. He was gone for approximately 8 minutes. When he came back, he was not alone. Ronaldinho Gaúcho, dressed in his training top, freshly changed and warm from the pre-match routine, walked along the front of the stands toward the third row. He was with the staff member and with one of the club's translators, because Ronaldinho's Spanish was functional but not fluent for nuanced conversation, and the situation seemed to call for precision. Several things happened simultaneously in the third row when this occurred. Eduardo became completely still. Marco, sensing a change in the air around him, the shift in the crowd's ambient noise, as nearby spectators noticed what was happening. The slight sounds of movement close to him, turned his face in the direction of the approaching footsteps. Ronaldinho stopped directly in front of the third row. He looked at Marco for a moment, not with pity, not with the performed compassion that public figures sometimes produce in these situations. He looked with something closer to curiosity, a genuine, uncondescending interest. He spoke in Portuguese first, then through the translator. He asked the boy his name. Marco, he said. Ronaldinho said, Marco, I heard you come to every match. Is that true? Marco's father had not told his son that he had written the letter to the club. He had wanted to spare the boy from disappointment if nothing came of it. So, Marco did not know about the letter. He did not know why this was happening. He only knew the voice. He knew the voice from years of radio, from commentary, from interviews played and replayed in his bedroom. He knew exactly whose voice this was. He said yes. I come to listen. Ronaldinho was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the translator rendered carefully in Spanish for Eduardo, who later wrote it down in his journal because he did not want to lose a single word of it. He said, I want to show you something. Can I take your hands? Marco held out his hands. Ronaldinho reached over the low barrier at the front of the stand and took them. He had a football tucked under one arm, the match ball brought out early, still carrying the warmth of being handled by multiple sets of hands in the dressing room. He placed the ball between Marco's hands and held it there for a moment, not saying anything, just letting the boy feel it. The weight, the texture, the give of the leather, the precise spherical geometry of the thing. Marco's fingers moved over the surface of the ball the way they moved over everything, slowly, methodically, learning it. Then Ronaldinho said, Every touch I make tonight, I want you to feel it from here. You cannot see what I do with this, but you can feel what happens to the crowd when I do it. And tonight, I will do it for you." Eduardo pressed his hand over his mouth. Marco said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "How will I know when it is you?" Ronaldinho smiled. The translator did not describe the smile, but Eduardo saw it and wrote about it later. That particular smile, the one that had been on thousands of magazine covers, that had been described by 50 different journalists in 50 different languages, that looked exactly like it looked in photographs, and somehow also looked like nothing you had ever seen before in person. Because photographs cannot hold what it contained. Ronaldinho said, "You will know. When the crowd makes a sound they have not made before tonight, that will be me." He held Marco's hands for one more moment over the ball. Then he gave the ball to the boy, not as a souvenir. Simply placed it in his lap, a temporary gift for the time remaining before the match. Then he straightened up, said something quietly to Eduardo, in Portuguese that the translator did not immediately render, but which Eduardo later asked him to translate, and walked back toward the tunnel. What he had said to Eduardo was, "Your son listens to football better than most people see it." The next 90 minutes were the most complete 90 minutes Marco had ever experienced at a football match. And what made them complete was not any single thing that Ronaldinho did on the pitch. Although what Ronaldinho did on the pitch that evening was extraordinary by any measure. What made them complete was that Marco listened to everything differently. He had always listened carefully, but now he was listening with a framework he had never had before. A direct connection, personal and spoken, between himself and the player whose presence in the game he had been trying to understand for years. When the crowd shifted, when the ambient noise changed its quality, when that particular rising sound began, that meant something unusual was developing. Marco no longer had to work to imagine whose feet were involved. He knew. He felt it. In the 31st minute, the crowd made a sound that Marco had heard before on the radio. The specific, half-swallowed collective sound of something impossible appearing in front of 70,000 people. The sound that comes before the roar, the microsecond of shared disbelief that precedes the explosion of noise. Marco gripped the armrests of his seat. His father put a hand on his shoulder. The roar came, sustained, total, the kind of sound that does not peak and then subside, but simply continues at a level that no longer has a ceiling. Marco could not see the goal. He could not see the run, the touch, the shot, the arc, the goalkeeper reaching and falling short, the ball crossing the line. He could not see any of the physical facts of the moment. But he felt what it meant. He felt 70,000 people become one thing at the same instant. He felt the entire physical structure of the stadium vibrate under him and around him. He felt the air change. The way it always changed at these moments, as if all those lungs emptying at once actually altered the atmosphere. And under all of that, underneath the layers of mass response, he heard in his memory the words spoken to him 40 minutes earlier. "You will know when it is me. When the crowd makes a sound they have not made before tonight." This was the sound. Marco recognized it. It was new. Even for Camp Nou on a Champions League evening, when the standard was already elevated above ordinary life. This was new. He started crying without being aware of it. Not sad crying, the other kind. The kind that comes when something you have been trying to understand for years suddenly becomes clear, not as information, but as experience. When the thing you have been listening to through a wall finally opens a door. His father, who was watching his son rather than the pitch, saw the tears and felt something he would later describe as the most complex feeling of his life. The particular mixture of grief and gratitude that parents sometimes feel when they witness their children encountering joy in the presence of limitation. when beauty and loss arrive together in the same moment and refuse to be separated. At halftime, neither of them spoke for a long time. Eduardo bought 2 cups of hot chocolate from the vendor, who came through the lower stands. Marco held his cup in both hands and felt the warmth of it. Then Marco said, "Papa, I think I understand now why the commentators laugh." Eduardo asked him what he meant. Marco said, "It is because it does not make sense. What he does. It does not follow the rules of how things work. And when something happens that does not follow the rules of how things work, sometimes laughing is the only thing you can do. Because what else is there?" Eduardo looked at his 9-year-old son holding a cup of hot chocolate in the 3rd row of Camp Nou in the middle of a cold November night, and thought that he might be the wisest person he had ever known. The second half continued. Ronaldinho played the full 90 minutes. There were more moments of the particular quality that Marco had now learned to identify, not by seeing but by the specific, acoustic signature of the crowd's response. Each time, Marco felt it before he heard it, the way you feel thunder before you hear it, through the floor and the seat and the air around you. After the final whistle, as the crowd began to move, and the stadium started its long process of emptying, Eduardo and Marco stayed in their seats. They always did this. The noise of crowds moving was disorienting for Marco in ways that standing still let him manage better, and waiting until the press of people had thinned made the exit easier. While they were waiting, the same staff member from before came back down to the 3rd row. He said that Ronaldinho had asked whether Marco was still in the stadium. The staff member asked if they would be willing to wait a few more minutes. They waited. 15 minutes after the final whistle, Ronaldinho came back out. He was in his post-match clothes now, his hair still wet from the shower, a jacket against the cold. The stadium was mostly empty. The lights had been partially dimmed. The pitch was quiet. He came down to the barrier again. He asked Marco what he had heard. Marco thought carefully before answering, in the way that children sometimes do when they are taking a question seriously. He said, "I heard the crowd find something it did not have before, and then lose it when you touched the ball, and then find it again, over and over." Ronaldinho was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "And what does that sound like when it finds it?" Marco said, like everyone remembers something at the same time. Something they forgot they knew. There was a long silence. The empty stadium held it easily. Those places are built to contain silence as well as noise. The architecture works in both directions. Then Ronaldinho said, "That is the best description of football I have ever heard." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and took out a wristband. A simple rubber wristband, the kind players wore during that period, yellow and black, with no particular monetary value. He held it out to Marco. He guided the boy's hand to it and let him hold it. He said, "When you listen next time, remember this. Remember that what you heard tonight is what it is supposed to feel like. Most people watch their whole lives and never hear it the way you heard it tonight." Marco held the wristband. He nodded. Ronaldinho said goodbye to Eduardo with a handshake and said something in Portuguese that Eduardo did not understand, but that sounded like a blessing, like the kind of thing you say when you want someone to carry something forward without knowing exactly what it is. Then he was gone. Back through the door near the tunnel. Back into the interior of the building where the lights were still bright, and the world of professional football continued at its professional pace, indifferent to the particular small miracle that had just taken place in the mostly empty 3rd row. Eduardo and Marco left the stadium and walked to the metro station. Marco held the wristband in his right hand the entire way. He did not put it on his wrist. He just held it, feeling the texture, the simple fact of it. On the metro, Marco asked his father a question. He asked, "Do you think he understood what tonight was for me?" Eduardo thought about this honestly. Then he said, "I think he understood exactly what tonight was for you. I think that is why he came." Marco was quiet for the rest of the journey home. Years later, Eduardo was asked about that night in an interview for a small local newspaper, doing a retrospective on camp. New memories from the Ronaldinho era. He said many things. He talked about the specific quality of the evening, the cold and the clear sky. The way the stadium smelled when you were close to the pitch, the particular sound of Marco's breathing when he was listening at full concentration. But the thing he came back to, the thing he said, he had thought about more than anything else in the years since, was the question Ronaldinho had asked Marco after the match. Not, "Did you enjoy it?" Not, "Was it a good match?" Not any of the questions you might expect. "What does it sound like when the crowd finds it?" Eduardo said, "He asked my blind son to describe what football sounds like." Not because he did not know. Because he wanted to hear it from someone who had been listening more carefully than anyone else in the stadium. He wanted to know what the thing he did every day of his life looked like, from the inside of a different kind of experience. He wanted to learn something. Eduardo paused in the interview for a moment. Then he said that is who he was. That is why the whole world loved him. Not because he was the best. There have been many who were technically better or more disciplined or more consistent. They loved him because he was genuinely curious. About the game, yes. But also about what the game meant to other people. About what it felt like from where they were standing. He loved football the way you love something when you understand that it does not belong to you. That it belongs to everyone who feels it. That your job is not to own it but to pass it on. And on a cold November night in Barcelona, with a blind 9-year-old boy in the third row, he passed it on. Marco grew up. He studied at university. He became, among other things, a writer. Specifically a writer about music, about how sound carries meaning, about the relationship between listening and understanding. He published essays. He gave talks. In every talk somewhere, he told the story of that November evening. He told it not as a football story, or not only as a football story. He told it as a story about what happens when someone takes your particular way of experiencing the world seriously. When they do not try to translate their experience into your terms or apologize for the fact that you cannot access theirs, but instead ask you to show them what you have that they do not. He always ended with the same moment. Not the goal in the 31st minute. Not the wristband. Not the goodbye at the barrier with the empty stadium around them. The moment he ended with was this: sitting in the third row before the match, with the football placed between his hands, and a voice saying tonight, "I will do it for you." Not, "I am sorry you cannot see it." Not, "I wish you could watch." Not any version of the loss. Just, "I will do it for you. You will not miss it. You will have your own version of it. And your version will be real, and I will know you are there, and it will matter to me that you are there." Marco always said, "I think about that sentence when I am working. When I am trying to understand what it means to communicate something real to someone whose experience is different from the experience the thing was made for. The sentence is, 'I will do it for you.' Not, 'I hope you understand it.' Not, 'I hope it reaches you somehow.' 'I will do it for you.' Deliberate. Directed. Personal." He said that is what Ronaldinho understood about football that very few people in football ever articulate. The game is not a thing that happens on a pitch and the audience receives it. The game is a conversation between the person playing and every single person watching and listening. And in any conversation, you can choose to speak to everyone in general or to someone in particular. That night, Ronaldinho chose to speak to someone in particular, and the entire stadium heard it differently because of it. There is a photograph that Eduardo kept. Not from that evening. No photograph was taken that evening, no journalist was present, no camera captured it. The photograph Eduardo kept was taken years earlier, when Marco was perhaps 5 or 6, sitting in the stands at Camp Nou with his head tilted back slightly, his face pointed not toward the pitch, but toward the sky, listening. Eduardo put this photograph in a frame. He kept it on the wall above his desk in the carpenter's workshop. When people asked about it, he told them it was his son at a football match. Sometimes people asked, but he cannot see the match, can he? How does he know what is happening? Eduardo always gave the same answer. He said he knows more than most people in the stadium. He just knows it differently. And that, perhaps, is the whole story. Whoa, that is the thing that happened on a cold November evening in Barcelona, when a man with the most naturally gifted feet in a generation of football stopped before a match and placed a ball in the hands of a boy who could not see, and said, "Tonight you will feel every touch I make," because he understood that feeling is not a lesser version of seeing, that listening is not an inferior substitute for watching, that there are ways of knowing a thing that have nothing to do with the ways you were taught to know it, and that sometimes, in football as in everything else, the person in the room who understands it most completely is the one everyone else assumed could not understand it at all.